Hello, and welcome to the lecture on social stratification. Let's start by breaking down what we mean by social stratification. This is basically the way society organizes people into layers or hierarchies. It's not just about individual traits like talent or effort, it's about how society itself is structured. There are four key things to understand about social stratification. First, it's a trait of society, not just a result of individual differences. We often like to think that people succeed or struggle based purely on their own actions or abilities. But stratification is bigger than that. It's baked into the system. It's about the way opportunities and resources are distributed across society as a whole. Second, stratification is passed down from one generation to the next. Sure, people can move up or down the social ladder, what we call social mobility, but overall, the structure tends to stay pretty stable over time. Things like wealth, status, and privilege often get inherited, not just earned. Third, stratification is universal, but it looks different in different places. All societies have some form of hierarchy, but what that looks like can vary a lot. In one society, money might be the main marker of status, while in another it might be family background, religion, or political connections. And finally, social stratification isn't just about who has more and who has less. It also involves beliefs. People often accept the system they live in because they've been taught to see it as fair or natural. Ideas like hard work always pays off or people get what they deserve help to justify and maintain the existing hierarchy, even when it's deeply unequal. When we talk about social stratification, it's helpful to begin with two basic types of systems: closed systems and open systems. In a closed system, such as a caste system, people are born into a specific social position that they retain for life. There's little or no possibility of moving up or down. One of the clearest examples of this is India's traditional caste system, where a person's status is determined at birth and influences nearly every aspect of life, including occupation, marriage, and social interaction. Caste systems are supported by strong cultural and religious beliefs and are often reinforced through practices like endogamy, marrying within one's caste, and following family occupations. These systems are rigid and justified by long-standing moral or religious ideas that discourage movement between castes. By contrast, open systems like class systems allow for social mobility. In these systems, a person's status is influenced not only by birth, but also by individual achievement, factors such as education, talent, effort, and occupation. Class systems are most common in industrial and post-industrial societies where the economy depends on developing talent and rewarding merit. This leads to the idea of meritocracy, a system in which people rise or fall based on their personal merit. While class systems aspire to meritocracy, no society achieves a pure version of it. Factors like family background, inherited wealth, and access to quality education continue to shape people's chances of success. One important distinction between caste and class systems is status consistency. In a caste system, a person's rank tends to be consistent across different areas of life, such as occupation, income, and education. In class systems, status consistency is usually lower. For instance, someone might have a high level of education, but work a low-paying job, or earn a good income but lack social prestige. To see how these systems can blend, we can look at the United Kingdom, which provides a historical example of how caste and class can overlap. In medieval Britain, society was divided into three estates: the hereditary nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. This system resembled a caste structure with limited movement between estates. Today, while the UK functions as a class society with more mobility, it still retains elements of that older structure, such as inherited titles and elite institutions that preserve status and privilege. Some societies have claimed to be classless, but in practice, inequality remains. A prominent example is the former Soviet Union, which declared itself classless after the Russian Revolution. However, people still fell into clearly unequal categories. High-ranking government officials known as apparatchiks, professionals and intellectuals, manual laborers, and rural peasants. These distinctions reflected a form of social stratification, even if they weren't officially recognized as classes. Interestingly, during the 20th century, the Soviet Union experienced about as much upward social mobility as capitalist countries like the UK and Canada. This movement wasn't usually driven by individual effort, but by large-scale changes in the structure of society, a process known as structural social mobility. For example, the post-revolutionary reorganization of the economy and state led to shifts in the social hierarchy. However, during the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, this trend reversed. The Russian Federation experienced widespread economic decline, as reflected in a drop in life expectancy. Although the economy eventually recovered, many Russians continue to face economic challenges. We can also see the effects of dramatic social and economic shifts in China. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, the Chinese government took control of all productive property and made efforts to reduce inequality. While this move significantly narrowed economic gaps, social distinctions remained, particularly the dominance of a powerful political elite. Today, China is experiencing a transformation as rapid economic growth, especially in coastal cities, has created a new class system. Thousands have become wealthy through industry and investment, while others remain in poverty, especially in rural areas. The result is a society that now features growing class divisions, even within a nominally socialist framework. These examples from around the world show that while the form and structure of social stratification may change, inequality remains a powerful and persistent force in all societies. Why does social stratification persist, even in societies that claim to value equality? A major reason is ideology, the cultural beliefs that justify and support particular social arrangements, including patterns of inequality. Every culture develops ideas that make its own system of inequality seem fair or natural, helping to explain why some people end up with more wealth and power, while others have less. This isn't a new observation. Plato suggested that every society considers some form of inequality to be fair or necessary for order. Marx also recognized this, but he took a much more critical stance. He argued that in capitalist societies, ideology works to defend wealth and power in the hands of a few, often presenting this concentration of privilege as simply the law of the marketplace. In other words, inequality is framed as the natural outcome of how the system works, rather than something created and maintained by people with power. Ideology isn't static. It changes as a society's economy and technology evolve, adapting to justify new forms of inequality that emerge over time. And while systems of stratification have always been difficult to change, challenges to the status quo do arise, especially when people begin to question the beliefs that make inequality seem normal or inevitable. Sociologists have developed various perspectives to understand why societies are stratified and how inequality impacts individuals and groups. The structural functional approach views social stratification as something that serves a purpose. It's seen as both inevitable and necessary for the smooth functioning of society. Central to this view is the Davis-Moore thesis, which argues that every society needs a system of unequal rewards to ensure that the most important roles are filled by the most qualified people. From this perspective, not all jobs are equal in terms of responsibility or skill. Positions like doctors, engineers, or political leaders require extensive training, high levels of responsibility, and often involve making critical decisions. To attract and retain people in these demanding roles, societies attach higher levels of income, prestige, or other rewards. These incentives are meant to motivate individuals to work hard, develop specialized skills, and fill roles that are crucial to society's operation. But while this explanation offers a functional view of inequality, it has several major limitations. First, it's not always clear how to determine which jobs are truly the most important. For example, why are corporate executives paid so much more than teachers or nurses, when all play essential roles in a functioning society? In many cases, it seems that some occupations are over-rewarded while others are undervalued. Second, the theory assumes that everyone has equal access to opportunities, but that's rarely the case. Many talented people never get the chance to develop their abilities because they lack access to quality education, financial resources, or social connections. As a result, stratification can block potential rather than reward it. Third, the theory tends to overemphasize high-paying, high-status jobs and underestimate the value of essential work that isn't profit-oriented. Roles like caregiving, social work, and community service often go underpaid and underappreciated, even though society depends on them. Finally, this perspective downplays the negative effects of inequality. When large numbers of people feel excluded or unfairly treated, it can lead to frustration, conflict, and even social unrest. In this way, stratification doesn't just support order, it can also undermine social cohesion. So while the structural functional approach highlights how stratification might help organize society, it tends to overlook how inequality can restrict opportunity, distort value, and fuel division. Unlike the structural functional perspective, the social conflict approach views social stratification not as a system that benefits society, but as one that maintains inequality and serves the interests of the powerful at the expense of others. From this viewpoint, stratification reinforces existing power imbalances rather than promoting stability or efficiency. A key figure in this tradition is Karl Marx, who argued that class conflict is at the heart of social inequality. For Marx, the economic system, particularly capitalism, is the driving force behind stratification. He divided society into two main groups: the capitalists, or bourgeoisie, who own the means of production such as factories, land, and businesses, and the proletarians, or workers, who sell their labor for wages. Marx believed that capitalists exploit workers by paying them less than the value they produce. This exploitation allows capitalists to keep profits while workers remain stuck in low-wage jobs, unable to accumulate wealth or improve their social position. Over time, this dynamic creates sharp divisions between the rich and the poor. He also introduced the concept of alienation, a sense of disconnection and powerlessness that workers experience when they have no control over their labor, the products they make, or the conditions under which they work. In this system, individuals become isolated from both their work and each other. Marx predicted that these tensions would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism and the rise of socialism, a system where the means of production are collectively owned and wealth is distributed more equally to meet everyone's needs. However, Marx's ideas have generated significant debate. Critics argue that some degree of inequality may be necessary to motivate people to take on demanding or highly skilled roles. For instance, offering higher pay for professions like doctors or engineers may be essential to attract the talent and commitment these jobs require. Additionally, while Marx anticipated a global collapse of capitalism and widespread socialist revolutions, that outcome has not occurred in the way he imagined. Instead, many capitalist societies have adapted by introducing reforms such as social welfare programs, labor protections, and progressive taxation. These measures have helped reduce, though not eliminate, inequality and have likely contributed to the continued survival of capitalist systems. While Marx's critique of exploitation remains highly influential, his predictions have not fully materialized. This is largely because modern capitalism has evolved, adapting in ways Marx could not have foreseen. As a result, the Marxist approach continues to be a powerful but controversial lens through which to view social inequality. Marx believed that capitalism would eventually collapse under the weight of its own inequalities, leading to a working-class revolution. But that revolution hasn't happened, at least not on the global scale Marx predicted. So why not? Sociologist Ralph Dahrendorf offers 4 main reasons why industrial workers haven't risen up to overthrow capitalism. First, there's the fragmentation of the capitalist class. Today, ownership isn't limited to a small elite. Many people have a financial stake in the system through things like stocks, retirement accounts, or company profit sharing. This blurs the line between capitalists and workers, weakening the us versus them dynamic that Marx thought would fuel revolution. Second, there's been a rise in the standard of living. In Marx's time, most workers held low-status, physically demanding jobs. But now, many have shifted into white-collar work. Jobs that are mentally focused, better paid, and offer more prestige and advancement. These improvements make workers less likely to want to tear down the system. Third, Worker organizations like labor unions have helped push for change from within. Instead of overthrowing capitalism, workers have used collective bargaining to improve wages, conditions, and job security. These reforms reduce the need for a full-scale revolution. And finally, there are legal protections for workers. Over time, laws have been put in place to defend workers' rights, things like minimum wages, workplace safety standards, and protection from unfair dismissal. These legal safeguards give workers a way to challenge exploitation without rejecting capitalism entirely. So although inequality still exists, these changes have made capitalism more flexible and stable than Marx expected. Supporters of Marxist thought argue that recent developments don't disprove Marx's critique of capitalism. They just show how the system adapts to survive. They offer several key counterpoints. First, while the middle class may have grown, wealth is still highly concentrated at the top. A small group of individuals and corporations control the bulk of economic power, which continues to create the kind of inequality Marx warned about. Second, white-collar jobs aren't necessarily better than blue-collar ones. Many of these jobs still come with low pay, little security, and high stress. Just because the work is less physical doesn't mean it's more fulfilling. In fact, feelings of alienation, being disconnected from meaningful work, can still be very present. Third, the gains workers have made didn't come easily. Things like labor rights, better wages, and safer working conditions were won through struggle, strikes, protests, and organizing. These are examples of the class conflict Marx talked about, and that conflict is still happening today as workers fight to protect what they've achieved. Finally, while there are laws to protect workers, Marxists argue that the legal system often favors the wealthy. Those with more money can afford better legal support and have more influence in shaping the rules. So even though legal protections exist, they don't always work equally for everyone, and this helps maintain inequality within the system. In short, from a Marxist perspective, these changes don't resolve the deeper problems of capitalism. They simply shift how those problems show up. Let's now turn to Max Weber, who offered a more nuanced view of social stratification compared to Karl Marx. While Marx focused primarily on economic class and the divide between capitalists and workers, Weber argued that inequality is more complex and can't be explained by class alone. He identified three distinct dimensions of social stratification: class, status, and power. This multidimensional approach helps us understand how inequality operates not only in terms of wealth, but also in terms of social honor and influence. Weber's perspective gave rise to the concept of socioeconomic status, or SES, a more comprehensive way of ranking people in society. SES combines various dimensions of inequality to reflect a person's overall position. Class refers to a person's economic standing, often measured by income or wealth. Status reflects the level of prestige or social honor a person holds, which doesn't always correlate with their income. Power is about the ability to influence others or control resources, regardless of one's wealth or prestige. By looking at these three areas together, Weber provided a broader understanding of how people are ranked and how inequality is maintained in society. He also pointed out that the relative importance of class, status, and power has shifted throughout history. In agrarian societies, status was often the most significant form of stratification. Landowners and religious figures held high prestige, even if they weren't the wealthiest individuals. In industrial societies, economic class came to dominate, as wealth and capital ownership became central to people's social position. And in post-industrial societies, where knowledge and technology play a central role, power, particularly the ability to control information and make decisions, has become increasingly important. Even though the lines between social classes may seem more blurred today, inequality hasn't gone away. In fact, many sociologists argue that economic inequality has grown in recent years. This resurgence of class-based disparity suggests that Marx's original concerns about a society divided between the rich and the poor still have relevance. While Weber's approach gives us a more flexible and detailed understanding of inequality, it also reinforces the reality that economic class continues to shape people's opportunities, resources, and overall life chances in significant ways. Now let's shift from macro-level theories to a more micro-level perspective on social stratification, offered by symbolic interaction theory. While most approaches to stratification focus on large-scale structures and systems of inequality, this perspective looks at how stratification plays out in everyday life, how it shapes our daily interactions, choices, and social experiences. In most communities, people tend to interact with others who are similar in social standing. We're more likely to form friendships, attend school, and work alongside people who share similar backgrounds and levels of status. These everyday patterns often reflect and reinforce the social divisions already present in society. As people move up the social ladder, their behavior often changes in ways that signal their new position. They might walk with more confidence, wear more expensive or branded clothing, or dine at upscale restaurants. These choices aren't just about personal preference, they're often about communicating status. This is what sociologists refer to as conspicuous consumption, buying and using products not for their practical use, but for what they say about one's social position. Whether it's a luxury car, designer outfit, or the latest smartphone, these items are used to display wealth and success to others. Symbolic interaction theory helps us see how people use these symbols to express and reinforce their social status in everyday settings. It gives us valuable insight into the small, often subtle ways that inequality is reflected and maintained in daily life. However, this perspective also has its limitations. Because it focuses on micro-level interactions, it doesn't explain the larger systems that produce and sustain inequality over time. It tells us how people express status, but not why society is stratified in the first place, or how these inequalities are passed down across generations. Still, by paying attention to the ways people present themselves, make choices, and navigate social spaces, symbolic interaction theory offers an important piece of the broader picture of social stratification. To understand how social stratification changes over time, it's helpful to look at it through a global and historical lens, particularly in relation to technological development. As societies evolve, the nature and extent of inequality also shift. In hunting and gathering societies, inequality is minimal. These communities depend on shared resources for survival, and without the accumulation of surplus, there's little room for structured social hierarchies. Everyone contributes, and resources are more or less evenly distributed. But as societies move into horticultural, pastoral, and agrarian stages, inequality becomes more pronounced. These societies generate surplus resources, which leads to the emergence of small elite groups that control land, tools, or livestock. As power and wealth become concentrated, structured hierarchies develop, often reinforced by tradition or religion. With the rise of industrialization, inequality takes on a new form. At first, the gap between rich and poor widens significantly, as those who own factories and capital accumulate vast wealth. Workers, meanwhile, often face harsh conditions and limited rights. But over time, things begin to shift. As labor movements grow and democratic reforms take hold, wages rise, working conditions improve, and the middle class begins to expand. This leads to a modest decline in inequality in many industrialized societies. This general trend is captured by the Kuznets curve, which shows that inequality tends to increase in the early stages of economic development, but can decrease as a society becomes more industrialized and begins to implement redistributive policies and protections for workers. By examining stratification in relation to technological change, we see that inequality isn't fixed. It responds to broader economic and social forces. As societies become more complex, the ways in which inequality is structured and maintained also evolve. While Canada is often seen as a predominantly middle-class country, it is actually highly stratified. Social class here is shaped by a combination of factors: income, wealth, occupation, education, and social background, all of which contribute to people's standing in society. Income is one of the most visible markers of class. It refers to earnings from work or investments. In 2017, the median family income in Canada was just over $79,000. But even with taxes and government transfers aimed at reducing inequality, income differences remain significant. And income is only part of the story. Wealth, which includes things like property, investments, and savings, is distributed even more unevenly. Wealth plays a powerful role in shaping class because it gives people lasting financial security, influence, and access to opportunities that income alone can't provide. It also enables people to gain political connections and exert control over important resources. Occupation is another key part of social class in Canada. We often assign social prestige based on the kind of work people do. Jobs like doctors, engineers, and lawyers tend to carry high status, while positions in retail, manual labor, or service industries are often viewed as less prestigious, even though they may be essential to the functioning of society. Education plays a major role in this system. In general, the more education a person has, the more likely they are to access better job opportunities and higher income. That's why access to quality education is so closely tied to upward mobility. However, not everyone starts with the same access to education, which means opportunities for advancement aren't evenly distributed. Family background, race, ethnicity, and gender also shape a person's place in Canada's class system. Historically, Indigenous peoples and racialized groups have had fewer opportunities to accumulate wealth or access power. These patterns didn't disappear with time. Systemic barriers still exist today, limiting mobility for many individuals and communities. Gender adds another layer. While men and women are found across all social classes, women in Canada still tend to earn less than men, are underrepresented in top positions, and face more challenges in building wealth or achieving high-status roles. Gender inequality continues to influence how resources and opportunities are distributed, even within the same social class. Defining social class in Canada is not always straightforward. One reason is the country's relatively low level of status consistency. People may rank high in one area, such as education, but lower in others, like income or occupation. Another factor is the potential for social mobility, which allows individuals to move up or down the class ladder over the course of their lives. Despite these complexities, sociologists generally identify four broad class categories within Canadian society. At the top is the upper class, a small but highly influential segment of the population. Making up roughly 5% of Canadians, this group controls a significant share of the country's wealth and wields considerable political and economic power. It includes both old money families, those who have inherited wealth over generations, and new money, entrepreneurs who have built their fortunes more recently. Many members of the upper class hold high-ranking positions as corporate executives or senior government officials. Within this group, there are two distinct layers. The upper class, often referred to as blue bloods or simply society, represents less than 1% of the population. These are families with long-standing wealth and social prestige. The lower upper class makes up about 3 to 4% and includes the working rich, individuals who rely on high earnings rather than inherited wealth. While they may not have the generational pedigree of the uppers, they enjoy similar levels of influence and lifestyle. The middle class is the largest social group in Canada, encompassing approximately 40 to 45% of the population. It plays a central role in shaping Canadian culture and values. This group is often divided into two segments, the upper middle and the average middle class. The upper middle class includes professionals such as doctors, lawyers, engineers, and university professors. These individuals typically have above average incomes, often ranging from $88,000 to $125,000 a year, along with higher levels of education and access to professional networks. Many are able to accumulate moderate levels of wealth and provide their children with strong educational and/or career opportunities. The average middle class consists of individuals working in less prestigious white-collar positions, such as clerical or administrative roles, or in highly skilled blue-collar jobs. Their annual incomes usually fall between $62,000 and $88,000, aligning closely with the national average. While they may not have the financial flexibility of the upper middles, many enjoy relative stability, own homes, and can modestly invest in their future. Below the middle class is the working class, sometimes referred to as the lower middle class, which makes up about 1/3 of the Canadian population. People in this group typically hold blue-collar jobs that are less skilled and often more physically demanding. Their incomes usually range from around $38,500 to $62,000, slightly below the national average. While these jobs require discipline and reliability, they often don't demand high levels of creativity or formal education. Benefits like health insurance or retirement plans may be limited or entirely absent. In Marxist terms, this group would fall under the category of the proletariat, those who sell their labor but do not own the means of production. At the base of the class structure is the lower class, representing roughly 20% of the population. Life in this class is often marked by economic instability and insecurity. People in this group typically work in low-prestige, temporary, or part-time jobs, many of which offer little to no benefits. While some may be slightly better off than the unemployed, they often live in poorer neighborhoods or rural areas with fewer resources and opportunities. Access to education, healthcare, and stable housing can be limited, making upward mobility difficult. Taken together, the four broad categories of upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class offer a useful framework for understanding how social stratification functions in Canada. While many Canadians tend to identify with the middle class, the economic and social divisions among these groups remain real and meaningful. These class differences continue to shape people's access to opportunity, their day-to-day experiences, and their long-term life chances. At the same time, it's important to recognize that class boundaries in Canada are not fixed. Social class is influenced by more than just income. It also includes factors like education, occupation, accumulated wealth, and even cultural tastes and values. As Canadian society evolves, so do the expectations, challenges, and experiences associated with each class. The result is a dynamic class structure that reflects broader economic, political, and cultural changes. Social class influences nearly every aspect of life in Canada, shaping everything from health and education to values, family life, and political attitudes. The impact of class is often subtle, but its effects are far-reaching and deeply embedded in daily life. When it comes to health, people from wealthier backgrounds generally live longer and enjoy better overall well-being. They have greater access to quality healthcare, can afford healthier food, and typically live in safer, cleaner environments. In contrast, those from lower income backgrounds are more likely to face health challenges due to poorer living conditions, limited medical access, and the stress that comes with financial insecurity. Class also affects how people view the world. Individuals with more education and financial stability often show greater tolerance for controversial ideas or behaviors. Meanwhile, those in working class or lower income communities may hold more traditional or conservative views, especially when it comes to social norms and values. This contrast often reflects the different pressures and priorities people face depending on their economic standing. Interestingly, political attitudes also split along class lines. Wealthier Canadians, while typically conservative on economic issues like taxation or business regulation, often lean liberal on social issues such as same-sex marriage or drug policy. In contrast, people with lower social status may support progressive economic policies like minimum wage increases or social welfare, but tend to hold more conservative positions on social and cultural matters. Even within the family, class plays a powerful role. Lower income families tend to be larger on average, and working class parents often stress the importance of discipline, conformity, and respect for authority, values that can help their children succeed in structured environments. In contrast, higher income families are more likely to encourage independence, creativity, and critical thinking. These families also pass down greater cultural capital, knowledge, skills, and social habits that give their children a head start in education and career settings. Now let's turn to social mobility, the movement of individuals or groups within a society's stratification system. This movement can be upward or downward and can occur either within a single lifetime or across generations. Intragenerational mobility refers to changes in a person's social position over the course of their own life. For example, someone might begin their career in a low-wage job and eventually work their way up to a management role. This kind of mobility reflects personal development, changes in employment, or educational achievements. Intergenerational mobility, on the other hand, looks at how social standing shifts from one generation to the next. For instance, a child born into a working class family might climb the social ladder by earning a university degree and securing a high paying job, achieving a higher social status than their parents. Mobility can go in either direction. Upward mobility might come through higher education, a better job, or marriage into a higher income family. Downward mobility can result from dropping out of school, losing a stable job, or experiencing a major life event like divorce. Social mobility is an important way to measure how open or closed a society's class system is. It reveals not just personal achievements, but also how opportunities or obstacles are shaped by larger social and economic forces. Recent research on social mobility in Canada, especially among millennials, those born after 1980, shows that the landscape has changed significantly compared to previous generations. While earlier generations often experienced upward mobility, today's young adults are more likely to experience horizontal mobility. That means most are ending up in social positions similar to their parents, rather than moving significantly up the ladder. Looking broadly, researchers have identified several key patterns. Over the past 4 or 5 generations, social mobility in Canada has been relatively high, allowing many people to improve their social standing. Some mobility over the course of an individual's life remains common, though the shifts are often modest. The long-term trend has generally been upward, with access to education and employment expanding opportunities for many. However, this upward movement hasn't been consistent for everyone. While living standards have improved overall, the pace and scale of those improvements vary widely. One of the clearest divides is by income level. Well-to-do families have continued to see their incomes grow, often securing even greater financial stability and access to opportunity. In contrast, middle-class Canadians have experienced little to no income growth in recent decades, leading to a sense of stagnation and economic pressure. For those in the lowest 20% of income earners, there have been some modest gains, but these improvements rarely translate into a stable middle-class lifestyle. The increases may improve day-to-day conditions, but they don't always lead to long-term economic security. These trends underline a key point. While social mobility remains part of Canada's identity, it is increasingly shaped by where you start. Class background, especially income level, continues to influence who moves up and who remains in place, making mobility less about merit and more about access to opportunity. When we examine social mobility in Canada through the lenses of race, ethnicity, and gender, distinct patterns of inequality come into focus. Historically, white Canadians have occupied a more privileged position in society, enjoying greater access to education, employment, and social networks that support upward mobility. In contrast, Indigenous peoples and racialized groups have consistently faced systemic barriers. These barriers, rooted in long histories of discrimination and marginalization, continue to limit opportunities today, making it more difficult for members of these communities to improve their social standing, even when they have the necessary qualifications or experience. Gender is another critical factor in mobility. Traditionally, men have had greater access to high-paying jobs and leadership roles, while women were often excluded from these opportunities or limited to lower status, lower paying work. Although the gap between men's and women's earnings has narrowed over time, this change is due in part to stagnation in men's incomes, rather than major gains for women. Women are still underrepresented in top-tier positions and continue to face challenges in accessing the same levels of wealth and authority as their male counterparts. So, while progress has been made, race, ethnicity, and gender continue to shape the pathways and the barriers to social mobility in Canada. These dimensions of identity intersect with class and income, influencing who has access to opportunity and who is more likely to remain stuck in place. marriage can have a significant impact on social mobility, particularly when it comes to building wealth. Research by Zagorski shows that people who marry and stay married tend to accumulate about twice as much wealth as those who remain single or go through a divorce. One reason for this is financial efficiency. Married couples often benefit from dual incomes while sharing living expenses. This arrangement provides greater financial stability and allows for more savings and investment over time. Simply put, two people earning and spending together can build wealth more effectively than individuals doing it alone. In contrast, divorce often leads to a decline in social position. When a couple separates, they typically have to support two households instead of one, which increases living costs for both parties. On top of that, women, who generally earn less than men, are more likely to take on the bulk of childcare responsibilities after a divorce. This financial strain can make it harder for divorced individuals, especially women, to maintain their previous standard of living or move up the social ladder. So while marriage isn't a guarantee of upward mobility, the research suggests that staying married can significantly boost financial security and long-term wealth accumulation. The expectation of upward social mobility has long been a central part of the Canadian identity, a belief often referred to as the Canadian dream. For much of the country's history, people have believed that with hard work and determination, they could improve their social standing and provide a better future for their children. This sense of optimism has helped shape Canadian values around opportunity, merit, and personal success. But in recent years, that dream has come under pressure. Economic trends suggest that the promise of upward mobility is becoming harder to fulfill. Many workers have seen their earnings stall or even decline despite working full-time. At the same time, the kinds of jobs available are changing. As manufacturing work has shifted overseas, it's often been replaced by lower-paying service jobs that offer limited benefits and few opportunities for advancement. These changes have had a noticeable effect, particularly on younger Canadians. A growing number of young adults are remaining at home with their parents well into their 20s, not because of choice, but because they can't afford to live independently. In fact, more than half of Canadians aged 18 to 24 still live at home, a clear sign that rising living costs and limited access to high-paying jobs are making it harder for the next generation to achieve the same level of upward mobility that previous generations expected. The shift toward a global economy has had a profound impact on Canada's class structure and patterns of social mobility. A generation ago, many Canadian workers had access to stable, high-paying manufacturing jobs that offered a clear path to middle-class security. But much of that industrial production has since moved overseas, where labor is cheaper and production costs are lower. In place of these manufacturing jobs, Canada's economy has become increasingly reliant on service work. While this sector is broad, much of the available employment is in lower-paying roles, positions in retail, hospitality, and food services that typically offer fewer benefits, less job security, and limited opportunities for advancement. This economic shift has led to wage stagnation for many workers and has made it harder for those in lower income brackets to move up the social ladder. With fewer well-paying jobs available and the rising cost of living, especially in urban centers, social mobility is becoming increasingly out of reach for a growing segment of the population. As Canada's place in the global economy continues to evolve, the gap between economic promise and reality is widening, particularly for those without access to higher education, specialized skills, or inherited wealth. Let's now turn our focus to poverty and how it connects to the growing trend of economic inequality in Canada. Despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, poverty continues to affect millions of Canadians and remains a persistent feature of the social landscape. Poverty can be understood in two main forms: relative poverty and absolute poverty. Relative poverty occurs when people have significantly less than others in their society, even if their basic needs, like food and shelter, are technically met. It's a measure of inequality that reflects how far someone falls behind the average standard of living. Absolute poverty, on the other hand, refers to a life-threatening lack of resources, such as clean water, food, housing, and healthcare. It's the kind of poverty that puts basic survival at risk. In Canada, poverty is most commonly measured using the low income cutoff, or LICO. A family is considered below the LICO if it spends more than 63% of its after tax income on essentials like food, clothing, and housing. This measure adjusts based on family size and local cost of living, recognizing that living in a city like Toronto or Vancouver requires more than in smaller or rural communities. Based on this definition, about 3 million Canadians were classified as poor in 2015. That's a significant number, especially in a country known for its social safety net and relative prosperity. Poverty in Canada isn't always visible, but it affects people's health, education, job prospects, and overall quality of life. And it disproportionately impacts certain groups, including Indigenous peoples, single parents, and recent immigrants. There is no single profile of poverty, but certain groups are more vulnerable than others. A generation ago, the elderly were at the highest risk of poverty, and there are indications that poverty rates among seniors may rise again. However, children are also at significant risk today. In 2015, about 1 in 5 children, 17.4%, lived in poverty, making them one of the most vulnerable groups. Visible minorities and Indigenous Canadians are more likely to experience poverty than non-minority Canadians. Systemic racism, discrimination, and historical disenfranchisement have contributed to the economic marginalization of these groups. One important trend is the feminization of poverty, the increasing number of women, particularly single mothers, who fall below the poverty line. Women, especially those raising children on their own, face greater challenges in earning sufficient income and accumulating wealth. Poverty is concentrated in Canada's largest urban areas, where the cost of living is higher and economic disparities are more pronounced. However, rural communities also face significant challenges, especially when it comes to access to jobs and services. When it comes to understanding the causes of poverty, there are two main perspectives. One that focuses on individual responsibility, and another that highlights broader societal factors. The first perspective is often referred to as blaming the poor. This view holds that individuals are largely responsible for their own economic situation. Sociologist Oscar Lewis introduced the concept of a culture of poverty, suggesting that people who grow up in poverty may internalize certain values and behaviors, such as fatalism, dependency, or a lack of ambition, that keep them trapped in a cycle of disadvantage. According to this argument, poverty becomes a kind of subculture that is passed from one generation to the next, making it difficult for people to break free, even when opportunities arise. So the second perspective is blaming society. From this point of view, poverty is not the result of personal failings, but of structural barriers that limit access to opportunity. Sociologist William Julius Wilson emphasized how economic shifts, such as the decline of manufacturing jobs in inner cities, racial discrimination, and inadequate public services, have created environments where poverty becomes entrenched. In this framework, unemployment or underemployment is not a choice, but a reflection of limited options and systemic inequality. At first glance, the fact that many poor individuals are not working might seem to support the blame the poor argument. But a closer look at the reasons behind unemployment tells a different story. Many people face significant challenges, such as a lack of available jobs, insufficient access to affordable childcare, or health conditions that limit their ability to work. These realities align more closely with the blame society perspective, which sees poverty as the result of structural conditions rather than individual shortcomings. In truth, both perspectives highlight important aspects of the issue, but the broader evidence suggests that poverty in Canada is more often a reflection of systemic inequality than personal failure. Another important group to consider when discussing poverty in Canada is the working poor. These are individuals who work full-time, often over 900 hours a year, yet still earn so little that they remain below the poverty line. According to recent data, approximately 746,000 Canadians, or 3.1% of the population, fall into this category. The existence of the working poor challenges the common belief that having a job is enough to avoid poverty. Many of these individuals work hard, but their wages are simply too low and the cost of living too high for them to achieve financial stability. This highlights a crucial point. Employment alone does not guarantee economic security. Sociological evidence supports the idea that the root causes of this issue lie not in individual failings, but in the structure of the labor market. More and more of the jobs available today offer low pay, limited benefits, and little room for advancement. These systemic conditions keep people in poverty even when they are doing everything expected of them. The burden of this reality falls especially hard on certain groups. Female-headed families, indigenous peoples, racialized individuals, and those living in isolated urban or rural areas are particularly vulnerable. Many face barriers to education, stable employment, and essential services, which further limit their chances of breaking out of poverty. The experience of the working poor reinforces a central theme in the discussion of inequality, that poverty is often shaped more by social structures and economic systems than by individual choices or behaviors. Homelessness is a growing and deeply concerning issue in Canada, although it's difficult to measure precisely. Estimates suggest that between 150,000 and 300,000 people across the country either sleep on the streets or rely on homeless shelters and services each year. Even at the lower end of this range, the numbers reflect a serious social crisis. For example, in Montreal alone, there were an estimated 20,000 homeless individuals as far back as 1996, a number that has likely increased since then. Homelessness is rarely caused by a single factor. Instead, it typically results from a complex mix of personal and structural challenges. Some individuals struggle with mental illness or substance use, while others are coping with the trauma of domestic violence, have lost their jobs, or are simply unable to find affordable housing. These personal struggles are often compounded by societal issues such as a shortage of low-cost housing, inadequate access to mental health care, and a lack of stable employment opportunities. What's especially troubling is the rising number of entire families experiencing homelessness. More and more, this issue is not limited to individuals living on the margins, but also includes parents and children who are unable to secure stable housing despite their best efforts. These families often fall through the cracks of social support systems, and their needs, particularly in terms of shelter, healthcare, and education, can be especially urgent. Homelessness, like poverty more broadly, is shaped by a combination of personal vulnerability and structural inequality. Addressing it effectively requires more than emergency shelters. It demands long-term solutions focused on housing, mental health support, income stability, and preventing social exclusion. Canada has long accepted a certain degree of economic inequality, grounded in the belief in competitive individualism, the idea that success should be based on talent, ability, and effort. This belief has shaped Canadian values around work, reward, and opportunity. For much of the country's history, there was a widespread expectation that hard work would lead to upward mobility and a better life. But in recent years, this ideal has come under increasing pressure. Economic inequality is growing, and with it, concerns about whether the system still offers a fair chance for everyone to get ahead. One area of intense debate is the rise of the very rich, especially when it comes to the salaries of CEOs and top business leaders. Supporters argue that high pay is necessary to attract the best talent, those who can steer companies towards success. But critics question whether these massive salaries are really justified, pointing out that high executive pay doesn't always lead to better company performance. In many cases, it seems more about prestige and status than measurable results. This growing divide between the very wealthy and the rest of society raises an important question. Can ordinary Canadians still get ahead? Recent economic trends suggest that the answer is becoming less clear. For one, wages have stagnated. Many workers are earning the same or less in real terms than they did years ago, even as the cost of living continues to rise. At the same time, many manufacturing jobs, once a source of stable, well-paid employment, have moved overseas. In their place, workers are often left with low-wage service jobs that offer fewer benefits and limited chances for advancement. These economic shifts have hit younger Canadians especially hard, with housing costs soaring and job opportunities becoming more precarious. More young adults are choosing or being forced to stay at home with their parents well into their 20s. This trend marks a sharp departure from previous generations and highlights how difficult it has become to achieve the kind of independence and financial security that once seemed like a given. As inequality continues to rise, Canadians are left to grapple with a pressing question. Is the promise of upward mobility still alive, or is it becoming another casualty of the changing economy? The COVID-19 pandemic didn't just bring a public health crisis, it also exposed and deepened long-standing social inequalities in Canada. One of the clearest patterns to emerge was how sharply class position shaped both health outcomes and economic impact. People in lower income brackets were hit hardest by the health effects of the pandemic. Many worked in essential in-person jobs like grocery clerks, warehouse workers, and caregivers that couldn't be done remotely. These roles placed them at higher risk of exposure, with fewer protections and less access to healthcare. In contrast, more affluent Canadians were often able to work from home or even leave densely populated urban areas where infection rates were highest. The economic fallout followed a similar pattern. Lower paid workers were far more likely to face layoffs or reduced hours, pushing many families into financial precarity. Meanwhile, higher income earners, especially those in technology and professional sectors, saw little disruption. In fact, many tech companies and high-wage industries thrived during the pandemic, creating what some have called an economic windfall for the already wealthy. As a result, the pandemic didn't just highlight inequality, it accelerated it. The gap between those with economic security and those without grew wider, reinforcing the connection between class, health, and opportunity in ways that became impossible to ignore.